Good evening, everybody, and welcome. I'm Warren Hoge, IPI's Senior Adviser for External Relations, and I'm happy to welcome you to this Beyond the Headlines event featuring Rashid Khalidi, the Edward Said Professor of Modern Arab Studies at Columbia University and author of Brokers of Deceit, How the U.S. Has Undermined Peace in the Middle East. I'm especially glad to have Rashid here because his book is timely and provocative, and because I see from the size of the crowd that there's a lot of interest in hearing what he has to say. And also because the Middle East is central to our mission here at IPI, and I want to take a moment just to boast a little about that. As you know, our president, Terje Rode-Larsen, was one of the creators of the Oslo peace process in 1993. Now, Rashid, I should note at the outset, always puts the phrase peace process in quotes. And he'll explain in a moment why he does that. At the time the Oslo negotiations were going on in the early 1990s, Rashid was an advisor to the Palestinian delegation at the Madrid talks on the Middle East. Gail, we're saving seats for you. Rashid was an advisor to the Palestinian delegation at the Madrid talks on the Middle East that took place in the Spanish capital and at the U.S. State Department in Washington. A particularly informative and knowing part of Rashid's book, by the way, is based on documents he had access to from that time and that I hadn't ever read about before. Terje Rode-Larsen went on to become special advisor to the peace process for the Norwegian government and then UN special coordinator in the occupied territories. He actually lived in Gaza at that point. And after that, UN special coordinator of the peace process and personal representative of Secretary General Kofi Annan to the Palestinian Authority. He still serves as a special envoy of the Secretary General and regularly travels with Ban Ki-moon on his Middle East trips. Not surprisingly then, we have an active Middle East program here at IPI conducting analysis and facilitating dialogue. Among our Middle East-oriented programs are annual retreats co-organized with Luxembourg and the United Arab Emirates, and another in Istanbul, a forum for Arab citizenship in transition that we carry out in partnership with UN Women, an Arab intellectual series that brings writers and thinkers from the region to IPI, and a field-based research project on Arab youth in Tunisia and Egypt, providing policymakers with insights into the priorities of youth activists in the region. Every September, on the eve of the opening of the General Assembly, we have an off-the-record Middle East dinner of some 30 foreign ministers and officials from the region. And in June 2010, a moment when Israelis and Palestinians were not supposed to be in any kind of contact, then Israeli Deputy Prime Minister Dan Meridor and Chief Palestinian negotiator Saeb Erekat appeared here together in a heavily attended public event in this room. So the Middle East, as I said, is a focus of our research and figures in many, many IPI events with prominent figures in public life and civil society from the region. And that has been particularly the case over the past couple of years of the Arab uprisings across North Africa and the Middle East. Now, on to our guest. Rashid Khalidi was born in Manhattan to a Lebanese-American Christian mother and a Palestinian Muslim father who had been born in Jerusalem. His father worked here for the UN Security Council, and Rashid went to the United Nations School. So he ought to feel right at home here, since in one account of his growing up that I read, he said that dinner table conversation consisted of what the British ambassador had said to the Israeli ambassador. After getting his BA at Yale and his doctorate at Oxford, Rashid became professor of Middle East history at the University of Chicago, where incidentally, he was befriended by a young Barack Obama. Now, you'll remember this period as the time when, in the words of Sarah Palin, Obama was palling around with terrorists. Brokers of Deceit is Rashid's 7th book about the Middle East, and it is at once a carefully crafted academic argument and a lively narrative with many citations and footnotes that I found actually surprisingly readable for items in agate type. I want to mention that there are books for sale at the door, and Rashid will hang out here when we wind up the question and answer period in an hour or so to sign them and to chat with you. Also, we are webcasting live, and while I ask that you silence the ringtones on your phones, you can leave them on if you would like to Twitter this event, which, by the way, we encourage. Our handle, by the way, is IPINST, think International Peace Institute, IPINST, and IPINST is also our tag. Finally, a good way to measure a piece of writing is to weigh it against what the author had in mind when he composed it. So let me end this introduction by telling you how Rashid described his purpose in the book. "If I have succeeded," he wrote, "I have shown how in American political discourse lies about Palestine are made to sound truthful, how crimes against people and against humanity are made respectable, and how the pure wind of terms like the, quote, peace process are given the appearance of solidity." Rashid, welcome to IPI, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Warren. Well, thank you for that introduction. I hope the mic is working. Can you hear me? Yes. All of you at the back included.
But can the webcast hear him?
Can the webcast hear me? Excellent.
Okay.
Excellent. Those of you at the back, I apologize that you have to stand, but at least you have access to the food, so there are some consolations for having to stand. I was actually going to talk very informally about this book, but Warren suggested to me that at least a summary of the book's argument was in order before we began a dialogue on it. And so let me begin by recounting a comment that Dr. Condoleezza Rice made as Secretary of State in 2008 to a Palestinian delegation during negotiations with the Israelis. She took the Palestinians aside and she said, and I'm now quoting from a document which is available on the Palestine papers on the Guardian newspaper and Al Jazeera website. The Secretary of State said, "I want to talk to you without the Israelis present so I can tell you what I think of your positions without hurting my role as an honest broker." Now, the Secretary of State was reiterating what I argue in my book is a central myth about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And this myth is that the United States serves as an honest broker between the two sides. It's a long-standing myth. I have the copy that I actually used during the negotiations of the U.S. letter of assurances to the Palestinian side, which was delivered on October 18th, 1991. In it, the penultimate paragraph begins, "The United States will act as an honest broker in trying to resolve the Arab-Israeli conflict." Now, I argue in this book that insofar as some aspects of the Arab-Israeli conflict are concerned, the United States actually has acted as a more or less honest broker. But that is not true insofar as the conflict between Israel and the Palestinians are concerned. And that is the main burden of this book, that the United States does not do any such thing. Indeed, I would argue that American policy has prolonged this conflict, it has exacerbated this conflict, it has made it considerably more intractable. And that what is at issue is not the conflict that's portrayed in American political discourse, in the august chambers of Congress, in the media, that is to say, a conflict between two peoples who in this country are usually defined as a victim and a victimizer. The victim in American political discourse, of course, being Israel. If you don't believe my characterization of American political discourse, you need only read the speeches of President Obama. Go back and read every single speech he's given. About 6 or 8 of them I actually analyze in chapter 3 of this book, and the weight that is given to the victim status of Israel is really quite considerable. He talks in many, many places about Palestinian suffering, but in American political discourse, there is a victim in this conflict, and it is not the Palestinians. And there is not a sense that there is an inequality of power in American political discourse. If anything, this is a conflict between two parties on a more or less equal level, and the United States is simply playing the role of, again, honest broker. So I argue in this book that this is part of a larger pattern. This is a part of a pattern in which language has had an enormous importance. I start the book with an epigraph from something that George Orwell wrote in 1946. He said, now I'm quoting Orwell, "The slovenliness of our language makes it easier for us to have foolish thoughts. If thought corrupts language, language can also corrupt thought." That is precisely what has happened with vacuous, empty terms like the peace process. The United States has purportedly been engaged in attempting to bring about a settlement between Israel and the Palestinians since, at the very least, President Carter went to Camp David in 1978. That is 35 years of uninterrupted, unmitigated failure. And we still talk about this process as being directed at peace. I talk in the book about some of the consequences of this policy, and I may come back to them later. But I would argue that, in fact, what we have had is not an American role as broker, but rather American complicity with a process which has led to almost complete dominance by Israel, or virtually complete dominance by Israel over the Palestinians. And one of the suggestions that I make in the book is that the distortion of language has made a crucial contribution to this process by, as Orwell would have it, corrupting thought and cloaking the real nature of these outcomes. One would think, as I show, I think, in detail in the book, that the policy of the United States has been very closely entwined with that of Israel. If you listen to American political discourse, this is not a great surprise. The way in which Israel is discussed in Congress by American politicians shows that most American policymakers think of American and Israeli policy as very close. And yet, there is a description of the United States as having a status of mediator. In fact, I think it could be argued that the high degree of complicity between the United States and Israel, and it has to be described in terms of complicity, should have disqualified the United States from playing the role of intermediary between these two antagonists. It does not. It did not. Partly this has to do with the failure of others to play a role as mediator, whether Europe, whether the Soviet Union and then Russia, whether countries like Norway, whether countries, up-and-coming countries like Turkey or Brazil, or whether old colonial powers like Britain and France. None of them have stepped into the gap. And partly because it insists on this role, and partly because no one else is willing to try and fill it, the United States continues to play it. And I think that the term complicity actually deserves reference to a document that I cite in this book, but which is never given sufficient importance. And this is a memorandum of understanding, which was reached between the United States and Israel in 1975 during the Ford presidency. And according to this understanding, which is in force to this day, the United States commits itself not to make proposals insofar as this issue, Palestine, is concerned, without prior warning to the Israeli side. This is the so-called no surprises policy. The United States is not supposed to surprise Israel as far as Palestinian-Israeli things are concerned. And what this basically means, and has basically meant, with very few exceptions, is that Israel has a chance to, Israeli policymakers have a chance to tell the United States, we don't like this paragraph, you shouldn't say this. And it has quite often led to major changes in the documents that are put forward. And I give an example in the book of a bridging proposal that the United States came forward with in 1993, when the Palestinian and Israeli sides were at an impasse in our negotiations in Washington. The Americans had said to us, we don't like to offer our own proposals, we want to leave it to the parties. But finally, in May 1993, perhaps sensing that this thing wasn't going anywhere after over a year and a half, Dennis Ross told us, we're going to produce an American bridging proposal. We were expectant of something interesting. What we got was a document that was less forthcoming than the last position the Israelis had given us. It was a document that was more Israeli than the Israeli position. And I have here actually the text of a discussion with two of the American diplomats responsible and leading members of the Palestinian delegation, in which they say, this is a document that has entirely Israeli substance. I mean, you've just put into your words what the Israeli position is, and in fact, the Israeli position was slightly better than yours. This is the kind of outcome that one gets as a result of this memorandum of understanding. It is, I think, quite revealing that in 3 enormously fat volumes of memoirs, Henry Kissinger doesn't see fit to ever mention this memorandum of understanding. I found it on the Israeli Foreign Ministry website, actually, where you can all consult it. It's a public document, fortunately, available online to all and sundry. In this book, what I do is I argue that this is a pattern, which I actually take back to President Truman. But I don't give you a blow-by-blow description either of U.S. Middle East policy since Truman or Roosevelt, or even of U.S. policy on Palestine. I argue that the pattern was established as early as Truman, but I use what I call three moments to illuminate this pattern. The first moment is the period from the Camp David Accords of 1978 through the Reagan Plan of 1982. As you all remember, Camp David had two components. One component was an Egyptian-Israeli component, and that ultimately led to the Egyptian-Israeli Peace Treaty of 1979. The other component was a component relating to Palestinian autonomy. The Peace Treaty component was eventually actualized, operationalized, and turned into a peace treaty, which is still in force. The Palestinian component, for several years, hung fire. There were negotiations. No agreement was possible. Israel clung to a position which it would not change. And in 1982, after the Israeli invasion of Lebanon, the Reagan administration saw an opportunity to try and implement, finally, the unimplemented Palestinian autonomy provisions of the Camp David Accords. And I actually didn't find, a graduate student of mine who was working on his dissertation on the Carter and Reagan administrations, he's about to finish, hopefully, discovered in newly declassified documents a confidential memo from the senior CIA analyst on the Middle East. I think it was probably Robert Ames. The name is redacted. It doesn't say who the person is, but I believe it was Robert Ames, who was actually killed in the embassy bombing a few months later in Beirut. In this document, this analyst, unnamed, predicted that in response to what President Reagan was trying to do, in response to an attempt by the U.S. to interpret the Palestinian autonomy provisions of Camp David slightly more favorably to the Palestinians, Prime Minister Begin would adamantly refuse to budge from his own narrow, reductive interpretation of the autonomy accords. And the analyst went on to say that in Begin's view, and I'm now quoting, the accords, that is to say Camp David, guarantee that under no condition can a Palestinian state be created. I'm still quoting this document. In practice, Begin effectively ruled out any exercise of Palestinian self-determination except one that continued Israel's preeminent position in the West Bank. I submit to you that you cannot have such a thing as Palestinian self-determination in a situation where you have a continued preeminence of Israel in the West Bank. And the analyst doesn't deal with that linguistic conundrum. But I think it is an absolutely accurate assessment, as is the rest of the document, which I quote at great length in the book, of not just the wish list of Prime Minister Begin. He didn't only say that he wanted there to be no Palestinian state. He didn't only say, as the analyst predicted, that Israel must retain the right to continued uninterrupted settlement in the entirety of the occupied territories, that Israel must retain control over Jerusalem, that Israel must retain control over land and water and so forth. This was not just the wish list of an Israeli prime minister. This became the fixed policy of his government and, in fact, of every subsequent Israeli government. It is the policy of the Israeli government to this day, I would argue. And what I try and show in the book, because this is not a book about Israeli policy, I'm not an expert on Israeli politics, though I can read, the Foreign Ministry website and see what the statements say. What's more important is that this has become the upper limit of what the United States will permit to be discussed. The limits, the restrictions that Begin imposed at Camp David provided the very low ceiling that in the invitation to the peace conference at Madrid, in the letter of assurances to the Palestinian side that went to Madrid, were defined not just by Israel, but by the United States. And much more importantly, in fact, by the United States. So I argue that this memo is not just, as I've said, a wish list of a particular Israeli prime minister. It is, in fact, it gives you the lineaments of the Israeli position that, with some changes, has continued essentially since 1982, since, in fact, Begin came into office in 1977. And worse, it constitutes the ceiling that the United States will allow for what is permitted to the Palestinians. So that's the first of the three sets of events that I examine in the book. The second is the 2 years, or almost 2 years, of bilateral negotiations between a Palestinian and an Israeli delegation. The Palestinian delegation was originally part of a Jordanian-Palestinian joint delegation, but we eventually got our independence, at least as far as negotiations with the Israelis were concerned. These are, as Warren mentioned, these are negotiations that I myself took part in as an advisor to the delegation. As you all know, this is not where the deal that regulates the situation today was struck. That deal was struck in Oslo. Terry Road Larson, as you mentioned, was instrumental in that deal. And if you're interested in my views on this, I'm not going to express them right now. You can read in the book what I think of the Oslo Accords. I don't think very much.
You were free to express them.
I will, believe me. I'm sure there'll be a question. Now these...
Terry himself would want you to express them.
I probably will by the end of the talk. In these negotiations...
Hang on just one second.
Yes.
Are you not hearing him?
Well, I hear a regular voice level. I don't know.
Okay, let me turn this thing off. I guess it's not working as well as it should. And let me turn that thing on. Can you hear me better now? Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, I apologize.
Thank you, Jeffrey.
We will get rid of this, and we'll go to old-fashioned technology, the microphone. So, as I've said, these negotiations didn't produce an agreement. But what they produced, at least for me, as someone who was present and as someone who started as, in part, a diplomatic historian at Oxford back in the 1970s, was a very clear sense of a couple of things that I think are central to this book. One of them is a clear sense of what the Israeli position is. But more importantly, one of them is how closely the American position is aligned on the Israeli position. And I quote in the book 15 documents from the papers that I collected during these negotiations, and they're all available online. If you buy the book, you can access the website. If you buy an ebook, the links are live, and you can go immediately directly to the documents themselves. And I think they're extremely revealing, in particular of American positions, as well as of the positions, obviously, of Israel. So that's the second moment. The second moment, which I think is particularly revelatory, was this 2-year period of negotiations going into and including eventually the Oslo Accords. The third moment, which I examine in the book, not on the basis of any kind of documentary record, because we don't have a documentary record for it, are the last 2 years of the first Obama administration. And what I argue there is that President Obama followed a pattern that a lot of American presidents, in fact, all American presidents going back to President Carter, with the sole exception of George W. Bush, have followed. And that is a pattern of perceiving that American policy of complete alignment with Israel on the Palestine issue is going to lead to an impasse, attempting at the very beginning of the administration, as Carter did, as even Reagan did with the Reagan plan, as President Clinton did, and as President Obama did, to try in some small measure to change that, and ultimately being beaten back, being forced into humiliating retreat from the positions that each president initially staked out. As you may remember, President Obama started off his administration with an appointment of Senator Mitchell as a mediator, and with a clear position on an Israeli settlement freeze as a precondition for negotiations, on the 1967 lines as the basis for a settlement with possibility of swaps, and on the absolute necessity of rapid movement towards a Palestinian state. As you may have noticed, by the end of his administration, all he and Netanyahu talked about was Iran. And what he ended up doing was climbing down from that position. So what I argue in this book is that these three moments provide a clear sense of policies that I think are really obfuscated. They are concealed. They are not illuminated by most of the writing on the subject. And I have to say, including writing of people who I think should do a better job of self-criticism in some cases, because they themselves are responsible for some of these policies. I'm arguing, in other words, that corrupt, deceitful language has played a crucial role in hiding what has actually been going on. In fact, this incessantly repeated mantra about a peace process has obscured the reality that whatever process the United States was championing, it did not achieve peace, and I think it was not really directed at achieving peace. It was directed at avoiding conflict with Israel, in other words, avoiding American politicians getting into trouble, both with the Israel lobby and with Israeli governments that could make their lives difficult. And it was devoted, some people would say, to conflict maintenance, certainly not to conflict resolution. I argue in the book the basis that I think American policy ought to be organized on in order to achieve a just peace. I'm not going to tell you what I think those things are. Most of you are associated with the United Nations. You know the elements of international law and UN resolutions that should be the basis for a resolution of this conflict. As you know also, the so-called peace process is not based on those things in practice. It is not based on rigid, strict respect for a variety of United Nations resolutions that are the overwhelming view of the overwhelming majority of the world's population. It is based on something quite different to that. What actually happened was not, in fact, mediation or brokering. What actually happened in most of the negotiations that I look at was the United States trying to pressure the weaker Palestinian side into conforming to the desiderata of the stronger Israeli side. I participated in negotiations that fulfilled that fit those criteria, and I have cited documents from subsequent negotiations. In particular, some of the documents involving Secretary Rice are absolutely mind-boggling, in which it's very clear that what the United States is trying to do is to not to get a solution between the position of the Israelis and the Palestinians, but basically to force the Palestinians to accept a position put forward by Israel. And that's a policy that was true under Clinton. It was a policy that was true under Bush Sr. It was a policy that was true earlier than that. I argue, finally, in this book, that to suggest that the Israel lobby has some kind of arcane influence over American policy in the Middle East overall is a terrible mistake. I argue that, in fact, on issues of strategic importance to the United States, and I cite a number of them, the power of the Israel lobby was shown to be quite minimal. On the Palestine issue, it has enormous valence. On the Palestine issue, it has enormous weight. But on issues of strategic importance to the United States, like peace between Egypt and Israel, which was crucial in the eyes of American policymakers over 3 administrations, Nixon, Ford, Carter, to American Cold War objectives, there was absolutely no hesitation in pushing, pressuring, forcing Israel to do things that American policymakers wanted. You can read the documents from 1973 are now available, Foreign Relations of the United States. You can read the 1967 documents again and again and again. When the United States wanted to achieve an overwhelmingly important strategic objective, there was absolutely no hindrance to putting overwhelming pressure on Israeli government after government after government. So to say that the Israel lobby is what guides U.S. policy is a mistake. This is only true on issues where overwhelmingly important strategic or economic interests are at work. I talk about other cases where this can be shown. For example, the sale of major weapons systems to Saudi Arabia have invariably gone through because far bigger lobbies than the Israel lobby, the oil lobby, the aerospace lobby, and the defense lobby are aligned with policymakers, and they push things like the sales of F-15s or the sales of AWACS during the Reagan and Carter administrations or other arms sales through without the slightest difficulty. The last thing that I think the book brings is an attempt to explain the particularly important role of the Arab Gulf countries in American policy on Palestine. This is to use the Sherlock Holmes metaphor, this is the dog that did not bark. Back in 1945, on his way back from Yalta, a dying President Roosevelt, he actually died within weeks of this meeting, met on the deck of a U.S. warship docked in the middle of the Suez Canal, actually in the Great Bitter Lakes in Egypt, with Abdulaziz ibn Saud, the founder of the modern Saudi kingdom, the founder and unifier of the modern Saudi kingdom. And the accounts that we have of the meeting indicate that the Saudi monarch pressed constantly the importance of the Palestine issue in his discussions with the president. The president had a lot of other things he wanted to talk about. They met for most of the day, or much of the day. And the accounts that we have indicate that Abdulaziz was quite forceful in stressing the importance to him of the Palestine issue. In consequence, as soon as he returned to Washington, the president directed that the State Department, in his name, send a letter, I think on the 8th of April, 1945, to the Saudi king, in which he made 2 promises. The first promise was that the United States would do nothing that would harm the Arabs of Palestine in its Palestine policy. The second was the United States would consult with the Arabs before it did anything. the president died within that same month. He died, I think, April 15th, a week later. And his successor initially denied that any such letter existed. President Truman publicly said we have no commitments to the Saudis. The State Department hemmed and hawed and finally produced the letter for the president, and he acknowledged that it existed. But from that moment on, American presidents, in my view, have betrayed those two promises. They've done a great deal that has gravely harmed the Arabs of Palestine, and they've done this by and large without consulting either with the Palestinians themselves or with other Arabs. And the point that I make in this book, and I quote I quote two American secretaries of state, are that Saudi Arabia, in the end, even though these promises weren't kept, didn't do anything about it. The Saudi willingness to remain silent was so striking that in 1948, Secretary of State Marshall wrote to the king to thank him for his, quote, and I'm quoting Secretary Marshall, his conciliatory manner over Palestine. Well, clearly, the United States had just sponsored the Anglo-American Commission of Inquiry in 1946, had voted for the partition of Palestine, giving most of the country to the Jewish minority in 1947, had recognized the State of Israel and sent it arms in 1948, and yet what Ibn Saud had produced was a conciliatory manner in the view of Secretary of State Marshall. Even after the Arab oil embargo of 1973, which King Faisal initiated and which caused a great deal of pain to the United States, Kissinger writes in his memoirs, the rhetoric of Saudi diplomats on behalf of the Arab cause was impeccable and occasionally intransigent. But behind the scenes, Saudi policy was almost always helpful to American diplomacy. So my argument is that it's really not the Israel lobby that drives U.S. Middle East policy. It's not on issues that have strategic or economic importance. It's not the lobby that prevails. In fact, it is rarely the lobby that prevails. In fact, there is no contradiction between American strategic interests involved in an alignment with the Arab oil-producing monarchies and American bias in favor of Israel, since the monarchies do nothing about that bias. They do not raise a fuss about that American favoring of Israel. As a result, the cost of that policy is small, and the lobby has undue influence because there's no countervailing, in other words, weight, domestically or internationally. Now, as you will have noticed if you pay any attention to the Arab world, the overwhelming bulk of Arab public opinion abhors U.S. bias in favor of Israel. It is a subject of a great deal of dismay in most of the Arab world. But as you will have also noticed, at least until the revolutions of the last couple of years, most Arab states have traditionally not been democracies. Hopefully, we now have the beginnings of democracy in Egypt, in Tunisia, in Yemen, and inshallah, hopefully, in Syria. Indeed, many Arab governments, many Arab rulers have been heavily dependent on U.S. favor. And in consequence, whatever public opinion thought in the Arab world, Washington could safely ignore whatever Arabs may have felt about Palestine. If, however, and this is a big if fundamental and lasting democratization takes place in the Arab world, I would suggest that that policy would become untenable. We will see whether this happens. The road to democratization is a long one. It requires multiple elections, multiple changes of government. The only two Arab countries that have had anything like that with real effect are Lebanon and Kuwait. All the others have had periods of democracy but have not had sustained democracy. And let's hope that we're seeing the beginning of it. If we do, and if the policies of Arab governments come to reflect the very strongly pro-Palestinian tenor of Arab public opinion, I would suggest that American policy on Palestine is going to be in jeopardy. So this book argues that American policies, which mainly are directed at catering to a domestic lobby, mainly are tenable only because there's no counterweight to this lobby, neither in the Arab world nor domestically, have not just been neutral. They have in fact been harmful. They have in fact been noxious. They have helped to produce a whole range of intractable outcomes. When we went to Madrid in October of 1991, the settler population of the occupied territories was under 200,000 people. That is to say, the occupied Arab West Bank and the occupied Arab East Jerusalem. The settler population today, according to Prime Minister Netanyahu speaking before Congress in May of 2011, was 650,000. That's probably an exaggeration. It's probably in the range of 600,000. It has almost tripled, or perhaps more than tripled. Settlers now constitute 1 in 10 Jewish Israelis. These facts on the ground were not coincidental results of some process determined by, natural population growth. They were the result of policies supported by Israeli policies, supported and defended by the United States, indirectly financed by the United States. In the case of 501c3 contributions, tax-free, tax-deductible contributions that go directly to the settlement process, actually financed by the U.S. taxpayer. And they were explicitly intended, these settlements, by Israeli planners to close off the option of a two-state settlement. I'd be happy to talk about this in question and answer, maybe, if you want to do that. But one of the arguments of this book is that not just Israeli policies, but American policies have made impossible the stated objective of U.S. policy, which is a two-state solution. So these are the realities. They're screened from the American public by a dishonest and debased rhetoric about a so-called peace process, about negotiations with an even-handed mediator, which are supposedly intended to create an independent Palestinian state, but which I'm arguing this policy has closed, an outcome that this policy has closed off. The United States, far from being an honest broker, was, in the view of a participant in the process, in fact, acting as Israel's lawyer. This is not my expression, this is Aaron David Miller's expression, and Miller himself used it in an op-ed and in his book, quoting, of all people, Henry Kissinger. And I think it's an apt description of the role that the United States has played. There were a number of patterns that contributed to this. I talk about them in the book. One of them is an exaggerated attention to domestic political concerns by American presidents. They and their speechwriters pay much more attention to voters, to political donors, to the media in this country, I think, than they do to the realities on the ground in the Middle East. Another is the complete absence of any kind of counterweight from the countries that count the most with the United States in the Middle East, the oil monarchies of the Gulf. And the last is the fact that whatever some policymakers have said, and I think that in the case of two of them, one of whom I've actually met and the other, well, actually both of whom I've met, President Carter and Secretary of State Baker, in spite of what I think were sincere expressions by American policymakers of concerns for Palestinian rights, in practice, Palestinian rights have not really been a primary objective of American policy. This meant that while Israeli governments got what they wanted, a peaceful and just resolution of this conflict was not the result of American policy. Quite the contrary. I argue that the policies of this country have not served the U.S. national interest. That national interest would, in fact, be served by a just and a lasting resolution of this conflict. Nor have these policies served the interest of international peace and stability. You, especially those of you in the front row who deal with this daily at the United Nations and others who work at know that this is a lasting source of instability. So the interests of peace and stability internationally are not served. And finally, this policy hasn't served the interests of the Palestinians, for sure. And it has not, arguably, served the interests of the Israelis either. I argue in this book that it has taken a great deal of what George Orwell called corrupt language to conceal these ugly realities. Thank you very much.
I'm going to ask Rashid 2 or 3 questions of my own, and then eager to get your thoughts and questions and comments. Rashid, just to bring it right up to the current time, I want to talk about the Obama trip to the Middle East just completed. He was given some credit, particularly for having prompted a rapprochement between Turkey and Israel, particularly for speaking to a group of young Israelis, sort of doing to Netanyahu what Netanyahu did to him by talking around the leadership to go to people with who might be more sympathetic to him. But I didn't hear anything in his speeches there or comments that represented anything that the Palestinians would want to hear. Did I miss something? And how did the Palestinians react to that?
Okay, well, you asked several questions there. In fact, the president did something quite different to what Prime Minister Netanyahu generally does when he comes here. The Prime Minister speaks to two groups of people when he comes here. Three groups, actually. He speaks to the American political elite, Congress in particular. He is rapturously received there. He's better received in the U.S. Congress than he is in the Israeli Knesset, by the way. He doesn't get 35 standing ovations in the Israeli Knesset ever. And that's what he got in his second to last speech to our Congress. So he speaks to the political elite, and he speaks over the head of the president through the media. In that sense, you're right. President Obama, in fact, I think slighted the Israeli political elite by not speaking to them. I mean, he had the option of doing what American leaders and other leaders often do, which is speaking to the parliament, speaking to the Knesset. He did not do that. He spoke over the head of Israeli politicians who he was implicitly saying are deaf to what he wanted to say to Israeli youth. As to what he said, I think the president's speeches really bear careful reading, because I think you have to read in particular the speech that he gave to young Israelis very, very carefully, as I've tried to read all of his speeches. The first thing that I would say is that the narrative that is espoused in his speeches is essentially an Israeli narrative. I think that this speech could have been written by a leader of the United Jewish Appeal, by a leader of AIPAC, to be given to the faithful, at least the first two-thirds of it. It was replete with every single trope of the Israeli version of reality. Biblical, Holocaust-related, desert blooming, miracle. I mean, he didn't miss a note. We know who his speechwriter is.
And by he, you mean Ben Rhodes.
The president. Yes, precisely. We know who the president's speechwriter is. The credit goes to Ben Rhodes. Front page, New York Times, 10 days ago. Read all about it. Now, there were a couple things in there that were directed to the Palestinians. Some of them, I think, were intended to mollify the Palestinians, and some of them, I think, quite seriously alienated them. In a conflict in which the casualty ratio depends on how you count it, 8-1, 6-1, 4-1, 10-1, he came to Ramallah and he talked about Israeli victims by name, without mentioning Palestinians. That was a gratuitous insult, or at least it was taken as a gratuitous insult by Palestinians, and the Palestinian reaction was quite negative. Even President Abbas, if you saw the footage, did not look like a happy man at that meeting. So I think that the president was doing what he did partly for domestic political reasons, and partly because I think he thinks he's playing a long game. He doesn't think he can do anything with this Israeli government. He's hoping that something else will come along, and that maybe when that happens, he can deal with it. I don't think he furthered in any way any prospects of a resolution of the conflict, in any way.
Hamas Fatah, which is always a comment that people will make when the suggestion that there could be a Palestinian representative to deal with the Israeli side. I think I know you believe that Hamas actually, in the end, might be in favor of a two-state solution. I'd like to ask you to talk about that. And also, how bothered are you by a story, and I never hesitate to mention the New York Times, on the front page of the New York Times today, saying that Hamas is now asking for a more rigorous separation of the sexes in schools in Gaza, and also is proposing a regimen of punishment for anyone or any institution that would favor the normalization of ties with Israel.
Mm-hmm. Well, if you read Faris Akram's story carefully, you will realize that, firstly, Hamas was legislating what has been practiced for a long time, except in very few schools, because the sexes are already separated in Gaza schools. So what they were doing is scoring a political point with some constituency of theirs, presumably, without actually changing anything on the ground. The second thing is, as Faris Akram also correctly pointed out, since Israelis are not allowed to go to Gaza because of the closure and siege, the second policy has no effect. It's impossible to normalize with Israelis or have anything to do with Israelis if you're in the Gaza Strip, because they're not allowed to enter and you're not allowed to exit. So, Israeli policies guarantee that there is no possibility of normalization even before Hamas gratuitously legislates against normalization. Let me talk about Hamas and Fatah, because I have two things to say about this subject. The first is that I think that both leaderships have terribly failed their peoples. Both Hamas and Fatah have terribly failed their people in perpetuating the split between them, in working for what I would argue are narrow partisan objectives rather than the national interest, and in failing to generate any sense of a strategy for changing the unfavorable situation of the Palestinians. The only justification of a Palestinian national liberation movement is that it advances the national aims of the Palestinians. I think that Fatah has miserably failed to do so in its dominance of the PLO in the last few years, in its dominance of the PA in Ramallah, and in any other way. And I would argue that Hamas, since it's been the majority party starting in 2006, and since it has controlled the Gaza Strip since soon after that, has equally failed to put forward a strategy which has in any measurable, significant way improved the situation of the Palestinians insofar as achieving their national objectives. So I would give both of them an F as political movements. Having said that, it is nevertheless, since they are the two parties in presence, it is their bound responsibility, if they have any conscience at all, to reconcile on whatever grounds. I seriously doubt that some differences can be overcome, but even a paper reconciliation is preferable to a perpetuation of this division. The last thing I want to say is that I think both of them are attached to a two-state solution. Hamas doesn't admit it. Hamas wants to have the benefits of intercourse while proclaiming it remains a virgin. You can't do that, of course. When it entered into the Palestinian Authority elections, it was in effect accepting the entire Oslo process. It was not being elected to some assembly of angels. It was being elected to a body which is part of a process negotiated by the PLO in 1993, which it was thereby accepting. And it has no alternative but to accept that logic if it wants to be part of that process, which it clearly does. It now governs Gaza on the context of that process. And you don't really actually have to do archaeology or verbal, deep verbal digging to realize that whatever they say about never recognizing Israel, Hamas is perfectly willing to allow a Palestinian Authority of which it's part to negotiate with Israel as long as the agreement that's concluded is submitted to a referendum. So yes, they do accept a two-state solution. The sad thing is a two-state solution, in my view, has probably passed us by while these two were squabbling and making it less possible.
Then one last question on that same point. If it has passed the spot, well, let me argue the other way. The inevitability of the two-state solution, and I'm now thinking about it as
inevitability.
Inevitability. And I'm thinking about it as existential, not for the Palestinians, but for Israel. If trends, demographic trends, whatever, go for another 20, 25 years the way they are right now, Israel will no longer be the Jewish state, and it will no longer be a democracy. That cannot be allowed to happen, or let me put it this way, the United States and Western backers of Israel would be in a very difficult position to support such a state that was basically an apartheid state at that point, an authoritarian state, and no longer a democracy. So it's inevitable, isn't it? At some point...
Would there be a two-state solution?
Yeah.
Well, I don't think anything is inevitable. I don't think that it's impossible to achieve a two-state solution. And I don't see a very attractive one-state solution on the horizon. But I would argue that since 1977, the person whose views have had the most impact on this is Menachem Begin. I think you should go back and read the Likud electoral platform of 1977. You should read the documents that I cite of Begin's. One of them is the handwritten notes that Begin that are in the Israel State Archives. They're now open for public access. Some in Hebrew, some in English, in which he sets his desiderata out for the Camp David negotiations of 1978. And Begin set out, in my view, the lineaments of what we have today. The Palestinian Authority is based on Begin's vision of autonomy. And Begin's vision is based on one sovereignty between the Mediterranean and the Jordan River. And that is what we have today. And that is what we're going to have for the foreseeable future. That is a one-state solution. It is not a democratic solution. It is not a just solution. It is not a solution which involves equal rights. It is a solution which obviously has to be modified, because otherwise you're going to have the situation that you talked about. You're going to have, in effect, the incorporation, whether formal and legal or de facto, of the entirety of the former territory of mandatory Palestine into Israel, which is what Begin wanted. As far as he was concerned, as far as his successors, including the present Prime Minister of Israel, is concerned, all of Palestine is the land of Israel, Eretz Israel. And the only people that has legitimate rights in that land is the Jewish people. And that is not only his vision, that is the basis for the various actions that have been taken, especially building of settlements and the creation of a legal structure, which have, in my view, created a de facto one-state solution. So you can argue we could devolve from that, we could move away from that to a two-state solution. I would like to see somebody explain, first of all, how you change the present reality. How do you move not just a few settlement blocks, the settlements that were created where they were created in order to make a contiguous Palestinian state impossible. Ariel, Ma'ali Adamim, there's 4 or 5 sets of them, which were put where they were put, so you cannot have a West Bank-based state. And secondly, how you dismantle that legal structure. And then thirdly, how you can have a state, a fifth of whose population is non-Jewish, where you have a whole framework of laws that privilege the other 4/5. How is that state democratic? It has obviously characteristics of democracy. But even speaking of Palestinians who are citizens of the State of Israel, they are excluded from a whole category, whole sets of categories of rights by the structure of the state insofar as it's Jewish. Whereas they're included, for example, the right to vote, the right to carry a passport and so forth, insofar as it is a state of its citizens.
I can complete that thought for you. In the book, you talk about a day of reckoning. And you say when Arab societies become more representative, become democracies, there will be a day of reckoning for the United States. What will happen on that day?
What will happen on that day, if it comes, I mean, again, nothing is inevitable. When my father was posted in Korea by the United Nations to head the United Nations Commission for Unification and Rehabilitation of Korea, which did no reunifying and no rehabilitating, by the way, we lived in a dictatorship, which is to say, we lived in a Korean society that was run by a military dictator. His name was Park Chung-hee. His daughter is the elected president of Korea today. East Asia was dominated by dictatorships. Southeast Asia was dominated by dictatorships. South Asia was dominated by dictatorships. Latin America, this is the 60s, was dominated by dictatorships. Eastern Europe was dominated by communist dictatorships. All of those regions have democratized. Turkey has democratized. The only region that has been immune to this wave of democratization in the entire world are the Arab countries. Now, they may remain an anomaly for the rest of time. I'm a historian. I talk about the past. I can't tell you what's going to happen. But I doubt it. I somehow don't think that Arabs are immune to the trends that affect everybody else. They have 2 horrible plagues. The first is oil, which distorts development in a variety of ways, and politics. And the second is it's the most strategically important region in the world. And so there's a lot of interference from the outside. But notwithstanding that, I think that sooner or later these changes will come. When they come, American strategic interests will have to align with American policy on Palestine. In other words, if the United States wants access to this region, if the United States wants a privileged position vis-a-vis the energy resources of the region, then it'll either have to conquer the region against the will of all of its peoples and their democracies, or it'll have to change its policy.
Excellent. I'd love to get some questions. You just raise your hand, and we'll go right here in the first. I'll take 3 at once. I've got 1 and 2. A third hand. 3, all in the front row. When you get the microphone, introduce yourself, and also hold it steady because it's being recorded for the website.
My name is Raquel Ramati, and I have a few questions. One, I'm surprised that you minimize the legalization of the Hamas, which I wanted to ask you, which Warren asked you about, that was in... that you minimize the fact that the Hamas wants to legalize, both in terms of the schools and in terms of the relationship with Israel, because I personally know of several nonprofit organizations that have a relationship between Hamas and Israel, including people in the Gaza that come to Israeli hospitals. And also in terms of the schools, I think the fact that you legalize something, even if it is practiced, it's still not a fait accompli. So that kind of surprises me, although I have a lot of respect for a lot of other things that you were saying. The second thing I wanted to ask you is, when Sharon decided to leave the settlements in Gaza, how come it didn't have the kind of impact that we expect to have when you leave the settlements, or if any resolution would happen one day of the settlements in the West Bank?
Right behind you.
Shazia Rafi from Parliamentarians for Global Action. Coming back to this issue of United States strategic policy and its policy on Palestine, you go back, at least in your talk, I haven't read the book, which I look forward to in the e-version, to 1958. But I want, as a diplomatic historian, could you reflect a little bit further back to the period of the King-Crane Commission, which was sent by President Woodrow Wilson over the objections of Lloyd George in 1919, and yet its report was not published till 1922. Was the policy ever different? And then the other question, why does the United States keep trying, in a certain sense, if it doesn't match its strategic aims? Yes, in a sense.
John Hirsch, first of all, thank you very much for your remarks today. Just so there's no misunderstanding, I was in the State Department in the 80s and I worked on a lot of these issues. So I recognize some of what you say, but I don't recognize everything that you say. Or agree with it. What's sort of missing in your remarks so far is any description of what you think the Palestinian leadership realistically can do now or over the next few years. I mean, you gave an F to both these people, or both these groups. So you've not mentioned the name of any individual Palestinian leader who might be able to come forward and put something new forward or put it forward differently that would have some traction. So I kind of wonder if there is such an individual. I mean, you put it very broadly in terms of democratization and somewhere in the future something will arise. But, beyond that, this sounds very pessimistic, your analysis. And then finally, what exactly do you think the Obama administration realistically, whatever that means to you, could do that it is not doing that would make a significant difference in the remaining just over 3 years of his term? Or is there nothing of that sort?
Three very good questions. Mm-hmm. Actually, about 6 questions, but three.
I got some from each, so 6. Let me start with John Hirsch's question, then Shazia Rafi's, and then you. Let's go back from the end to the beginning. It depends on what your definition of realistic is. The president is a man who, in my estimation, believes that he reads a political terrain, he reads what is doable, and he operates within those confines. And I think that has very much determined his policy on Palestine. He has a reading of the American political landscape, which, with all due respect, I think is faulty. I think that he showed in the last election that he actually has a lot more support for his approach than his actions would indicate. This was, in effect, for anybody who cares about Palestine and Israel, this was an election as between Romney Netanyahu and Barack Obama. The Republican candidate campaigned in Israel, and the Israeli prime minister campaigned for Romney. So if you felt very strongly, if you had a Likudist orientation, if you revered Menachem Begin, you voted for Romney. And the American Jewish vote broke down about 70-30. The president won an overwhelming majority of the votes. And so I think he's underestimating what he can do. But his estimation appears to be, partly for domestic reasons, and I think correctly insofar as what he estimates can be done with this Israeli government and the previous one, that not very much can be done. I think he had a different view when he came into office. I think he was disabused of that notion by the unpleasant experiences of the first 4 years. And I don't know what he's planning to do. I have no pipeline. I don't know. I haven't spoken to him for years. I have no idea. But I would argue his view of what's realistic and my view of what's realistic differ. I've just given you my view of what you could do. Now, your problem with doing what 70% of those voters and 53%, was it, of overall vote supported you for. The problem with that is that there is what I would describe as a consensus of idiocy within the Beltway in Washington about what is kosher and acceptable and what is not. And most of those things that you would have to do are not acceptable insofar as the political process is concerned, insofar as the think tanks are concerned, insofar as who gets on, Face the Nation is concerned. And that would be a problem. He would be going with his gut. He would be going what a few experts might tell him. He would be going what people might support him in doing, but not what the elites in the think tanks, not what certainly Congress, not what a lot of people in the media, whose thinking is utterly conventional, utterly unrealistic, and full of corrupt and dishonest language, in my view. But they are who they are. They are the pundits, they are the senators, they are the congressmen and congresswomen. And he would have to go up against that. I think he could do a lot. He could at the very least lay down markers and do what he did in Israel. Okay, you're a bunch of dinosaurs. You're completely hopeless. You're irremediably mired in the past. I'm going to speak over your heads to the much smarter young people in this country who understand that we can't continue to underwrite injustice and so on and so forth. And he can do that in subtle ways. I mean, he did a little bit of that in his address in Israel, actually, to Israelis, to younger Israelis. So there's a lot he could do. I mean, I could give you specifics. He could go after the 501c3 tax-free status of people funneling money to the building of settlements, for heaven's sakes. Violation of international law, violation of U.S. policy, funded by me and him and every one of you who pays U.S. taxes. Because those people don't pay taxes on that money, and we're paying taxes instead of it. So that's the second question. What do I think the Palestinian leadership realistically could do? I mean, look, okay, let me start with who. The Palestinians, over at least 4 decades, since the early 70s, have had a problem. The problem is anybody who sticks his head up is likely to be killed or imprisoned. So there are a lot of people who are not in the present leadership because they were so perceived as so effective that they either got a bullet or were blown to smithereens, in many cases by Israel, in a few cases by Arab states. Actually, the former Libyan government, the former Iraqi government, the Syrian government that's hopefully about to go down soon, or each have several major PLO leaders to their credit, and Israel has several dozen. As of this moment in time, the best leadership in the occupied territories is in prison. And in some ways, it's perhaps fortunate that they are there, because otherwise they would stand the risk of happening to them what happened to some of their comrades in the past. So I know a lot of people in Palestinian civil society who play quite heroic roles, but they're not, technically speaking, political leaders. The political leaders are either, as I'd say, the best of them are either dead or in prison. But what could Palestinian leaders do, or what could the Palestinian national movement? The first thing it could do would be to reconcile. This reconciliation is absolutely essential. The second thing that it has to do is to figure out what its objectives are. I mean, what do the Palestinians want? Do they really want to try for a two-state solution? And if they want to do that, how do they do that? What is their strategy? Do they endlessly petition a hostile America to please align itself with the Palestinians instead of doing what it has always done, which is align itself with the Israelis? I don't think that's the way you're going to get Palestinian rights, frankly. Do they continue to futilely go to the United Nations, which refuses to stand up against the United States because the United States has a veto in the Security Council? I'm not sure that that's going to work. Do they use violence? Well, Hamas has tried that. I don't see that it's produced results. And insofar as it involves violence against civilians, it's a war crime. It's a violation of international law. And you're going up against a people which does a hell of a lot better job in some international fora, and certainly in the United States, of showing every time you victimize it that it is the victim, than do the Palestinians. So, I mean, it's not only some of it is immoral, it's ineffective, and in fact, in some cases, quite harmful. So I would suggest that if the Palestinians are going to resist, they have to figure out some nonviolent way to put pressure on Israel, whether that's BDS, whether that's the kinds of boycotts and protests and so on that some villages in the West Bank undertake. I don't know. I mean, this is not you've taken me beyond my sphere of competence right now with that question. To the two questions about why does the United States keep trying on Palestine. Well, it keeps trying on Palestine partly to keep up appearances. In other words, the United States has made enormous efforts to achieve certain changes in the structure of the Middle East. It brought about effectively, the peace treaty between Egypt and Israel was an effort by President Sadat and two American presidents, three American presidents. If you go back to Nixon and Ford, who put together the disengagement agreements, which were the basis for what President Carter negotiated. It appears that American presidents feel they can't also appear to try to do something about the Palestine issue, partly for the amour propre of Arab governments, but partly also because some of them feel that this is a necessity. I think there was an actual moral basis to President Carter's approach. And I think there was actually a human element to the way in which Secretary Baker saw the thing. Baker is not a man who many people would have described as a great humanist, or a person, susceptible to an excess of feeling. But I believe that on in some respects, he actually was touched by the situation. And so there is that. I mean, and I think this president also feels some of these things, and that's part of it. Was American policy ever different? The United States wasn't a Middle East power at that time, at the time of the King-Crane Commission. President Wilson issued his 14 points, insisted that the colonial powers abjure their nasty colonial habits, went to Paris and helped to create a League of Nations, which he was not able to get his own Senate to vote for. And the United States disappeared from the Middle East for the next 20 years. So American policy was of no importance, really, until World War II, when American troops landed in the Middle East, from which point onwards the United States has been the hegemonic power in the Middle East. So from 1942, the landings in North Africa, and 1943, the landings in North Africa, and the sending of American troops to Iran, the United States has been the most important Middle East power, with the Soviet Union for a period the second most important. So it's apples and oranges. It really didn't matter, King Crane, in fact. The British, as you said, it was not only not published in this country, the British completely ignored it. They refused to take part, as did the French. To your two questions, I think it's really important when you talk about not just the removal of the settlements in Gaza, but the evacuation, the redeployment of Israeli forces from the Gaza Strip, to understand that what Sharon was doing was both a response to what was perceived a military necessity, because Gaza was very hard to control, and also an attempt to win President Bush over to specific things that Israel wanted in the West Bank. And they got that in the April, I forget the date, April 18th letter, 2004, where President Bush, for the first time, recognized Israel had a right to what were called settlement blocks. And I don't have the language in my mind. It's somewhere in the third, I think, chapter of the book. Basically, from being opposed to Israeli settlements, considering them as illegal, the president was moved, and this was really Sharon's doing, into giving an Israeli prime minister for the first time American recognition that the settlement blocks in the West Bank would be retained as part of a final settlement. He also got the United States to for the first time, take the Israeli position on refugees. And so what he was doing was trading Gaza, which was a liability, for the West Bank, which is what really Begin and he and Israeli prime ministers of that persuasion have been primarily interested in. To your first question, I wasn't really minimizing Hamas's language. What I was saying was that in fact there's no real change. Now you're right. It takes a reprehensible policy and formalizes it. What has been a de facto policy is now a de jure policy, and I suppose that's worse. But there's no real or very little real change that's going to come about as a result of it. That's what I was saying.
I have a question in the front row. I have a question in the front row. Jeffrey, did you? Excellent. And I would take a third, and the third hand in the middle, right here. So we'll go 1, 2, 3, and we'll still have some time.
Okay. Thank you very much. I think this is an extremely important discussion. And I assume that...
Go, I have to ask you to introduce yourself.
Oh, so sorry. I'm Geir Pedersen. I'm the Norwegian ambassador to the UN. And I assume you agree that to actually have a solution, we would need a US involvement in the process, and that it's actually doable. But I would like to ask you on what I see as your key point, and that is, if I understood you correctly, that you said something to the effect that Begin's restrictions sort of is the upper limit to what the US could do. Mm-hmm. And my interpretation was also that that is also the upper limit as to what the Israelis would do. And I would like you then just to have your thinking on how you see within this context the Clinton parameters in December 2000 and how they developed, and also how you view Olmert's proposal, which at least some of us would see went even further than the Clinton parameters.
2008.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Keep that thought. I've now forgotten. Jeff Laurenti.
Jeff Laurenti with the Century Foundation. First, since you've twice mentioned both President Carter and Secretary Baker, and presumably behind him, the elder President Bush, you appear to imply that they may have been closer to that mythical ideal of an honest broker than has usually been the case. Both by coincidence happen to be one-term presidents, and while surely we believe it's for other reasons, there is a mythology also in Washington that it ain't unrelated. So if you could just take a second on that retrospective. But I am more interested actually in your talking about the prospective. We've seen in the United States in the past few years the emergence within the American Jewish community of a largely younger generation, liberal Democratic Party donors in J Street, trying to create space for a more what some would call even-handed or whatever, but a more nuanced position in favor of, quote, Israel and peace. We also have an immigration into this country that is already reshaping the face of America for the future. So you look 40 years into the future, and it's going to be a very different kind of electoral equation. You saw even at last year's Democratic convention, when after a right-wing generated furor over the omission from the party platform of the pledged that Jerusalem always be in Israeli hands, that there was actually on the floor of the convention what appeared to be a louder vote nay on the rushed effort to try to fix that problem, even though AIPAC had approved the new language, but they wilted as soon as the right-wing machine in the Jewish networks raised it. So what do you see as the future developments in American politics that may actually alter somewhat if we assume that European pusillanimity is perpetual and worry that Arab world fatigue is beginning to set in? Or do we not basically have to look to the internal American political dynamic?
Jeffrey, you could pass the microphone to the gentleman here. There, that's it.
My name is Vladimir. I'm a student from Slovakia. And you briefly talked about the rights of nations for self-determination, which has been a U.S. policy, going back to the Wilson administration, supporting the creation of national states in Europe, or going to such great lengths as supporting Kosovo, the creation of Kosovo. Why has Palestine been an exception of this for so long? And, since the U.S. has failed over the last 35 years, is there a country or group of countries that can replace it? Replace the U.S. in the process of spearheading the peacekeeping. The peace process. Can European Union be that country, consisting of members and prospective members that have waged wars against each other, or countries that have peacefully split up? Can there be a role model for this peace process?
Thank you.
Okay. Take those three. Well, let me start with Vladimir, and then I'll talk to Mr. Clementi, and then to His Excellency in the front row. Well, to start with what the Norwegian ambassador said, there's no alternative to U.S. involvement in some measure. The United States is the only superpower, and the United States has enormously important interests in the region. It's not going to allow itself to be excluded. So, to answer both of your questions, in some sense, there's no alternative to having the United States there. Having said that, the United States has played such a remarkably unhelpful role that I think you need someone else as well, at the very least. And to answer your question more directly, is there an alternative to the United States? There would be alternatives. Should the alternatives choose to come forward? But I have not yet seen any state or group of states that is willing to take on the United States on this issue and insist that they have interests in this. Now, energy, in fact, does not mainly flow from the Middle East to the United States. It mainly flows from the Middle East to Europe, South Asia, and East Asia. And so the people who have the greatest interest in Middle East energy are not Americans, even though American companies dominate the world oil trade. And in that sense, the United States does have interests that transcend actual consumption in this country of petrochemicals. If interests dictated this, we should see a bunch of Chinese, Indian, other South Asian, and European ambassadors howling at the American representative across the street and insisting that their interests, their vital national interests, dictate that there be a different policy on this. But one of the things the United States has been helped to do by some of its allies is to decouple the Palestine issue from a lot of things having to do with energy. We are therefore told that it doesn't really matter if a lot of people in the Arab world don't like Western policies on Palestine because they'll sell us their energy anyway. That's probably not true in the long run, but as long as you have the kinds of governments that you have, unfortunately, it is true. And the reason that you don't have, and I don't think the United States becoming self-sufficient in oil is going to make any difference in this, by the way, because this never was about American consumption. The United States was one of the biggest oil exporters in the world in 1945 when this process started. And the State Department said, this is the biggest prize. There was a State Department memo in 1945 that said, this is the greatest prize in world history. Not because we needed the oil at that stage, but because everybody needed the oil. And if the United States had a privileged position in terms of production of the oil, the United States had a privileged position in world energy. And that's why it's important, not because we consume it here. We don't. Most American oil either comes from Latin America or from West Africa or domestic or Canada. The last thing I want to say in response to your question about Europe is that insofar as some issues are concerned, there really is Europe. That is to say, Europe operates as if it were a unit. Where this issue is concerned, Europe doesn't exist, because there are such profound differences between some of the Northern European governments, broadly speaking, and some of the Southern European governments. The German, the Dutch, and a couple of other European governments simply will not separate themselves from the American position on this issue, or will not act in a way counter to how they read their own domestic public opinion. And other governments are much more forthcoming, much more willing, if not to challenge the United States, at least to say this is a vital national interest for us as nation states. And given the flow of immigration from the Middle East and West Africa to parts of Europe, it really is an important issue. It's a domestic issue in France. It's a domestic issue in a number of European countries. And they feel somewhat differently on this than other European countries. So there is no Europe. There's not one unified European voice. Why has Palestine been an exception to self-determination? Because it's not put that way in the United States. The way Americans are given to understand this issue is not that there is a people suffering that needs to be free. It's that there's an eternal conflict since time immemorial in which some people are being nasty to the Israelis. And the conflict has to be resolved so that the poor Israelis can be left in peace. It's not seen as there is a people that is under occupation or has been dispersed or driven from its homeland, and that almost uniquely among the peoples of the earth, with the Kurds and a couple of others, is denied self-determination. That's simply not the way it's understood. Now, that's changing, and that takes me to the question that you asked. That's changing in part because the American demography is changing, because American universities are changing, because American academia is changing, and because the American Jewish community is changing. All of those things are actually changing much more rapidly than I would have predicted 10 years ago. 10 or 20 years ago, 30 years ago, it was actually difficult to say Palestine, Palestinian in certain contexts on American campuses. Today, we have a Center for Palestine Studies at Columbia. Academics freely deal with these issues. It's not to say that there's not a give and take, that there are not more chairs of Israeli studies, that there are not more centers for Israel and Jewish studies on American. There are, but than Islamic or Palestinian or whatever. But that's not the point. The point is that there has developed a level of balance and objectivity within academia and on American university campuses such that kids are exposed to stuff that their elders that most people who went to university in the United States in the 70s or the 80s simply weren't exposed to. And you don't have to read Peter Beinert's book. You don't have to read the shock journalism on this to see the change, especially among younger people. They don't consume the same stodgy media which tells them these myths about the Middle East that their elders consume. They read and consume news in a different way than my generation or even my children's generation do. My kids are in their 30s. I'm talking about 19-year-olds. I'm talking about 22-year-olds. They're in a different world. And it's a better world in terms of access to information. And as a result, you have all the developments that you talked about in your question. You don't just have J Street, you have Jewish Voices for Peace. You have Students for Justice in Palestine on dozens of campuses, half of whose members are American Jewish kids. So there's this transformation that's taking place, which doesn't mean that the campuses have become, rampant sources of Palestinian support. Quite the contrary, there's a debate. But there was no debate 20 years ago, 30 years ago. There was no other voice, to be frank. And I think that in time, that may have an impact on American politics. I see absolutely no effect whatsoever in American politics up to this point, however, I have to say. We'll see what happens when these people get older, these kids get older and more conservative. You asked a question about President Carter and President Bush Sr. and their secretaries of state. I mean, I've never had the privilege of meeting Cyrus Vance or President Bush Sr. But I think that you're basically right. I think these were administrations from top to bottom. I mean, I know Brzezinski, and I know his views publicly and privately. And there are several people in each of those administrations who had a clear understanding of the importance of this, and who said, it may not be in our short-term interest because the Saudis will let us get away with anything. That is to say, we will not suffer strategically in the Middle East if we don't do this. But sooner or later, the crows will come home to roost. We cannot support an unjust policy. But there were a variety of factors that foiled them. And I honestly don't think that they're taking this position is what led them to lose those two elections. But you're right, both of them did end up as one-term presidents. The two last questions from the ambassador, one of which I've answered, but one of which I haven't answered. You asked a question about U.S. involvement. I've answered that. You asked a question about whether Begin's restrictions in terms of constituting the upper limit on U.S. policy apply throughout, and in particular, whether they apply to the Clinton parameters and to the Olmert, Abu Mazen, whatever it was. Part of the problem with both of these negotiations is that they came at the very end of two administrations that were, by the time these things developed, two American administrations that were lame ducks. And so what President Clinton was putting forward was almost in the nature of his personal position, because he did not really he couldn't commit his successor. And in fact, he didn't commit his successor. His successor walked back from the Clinton parameters, and President Obama paid very little attention to whatever it was that President Bush had reached at the time of the Abu Mazen Olmert discussions. But I think if you look very carefully at what Begin was saying, one of the things he said was essentially overall Israeli security control of the entirety of the land of Israel. And that is really present in important provisions of what President Clinton put forward as his parameters. In many cases, it was described as multi-year control of the Jordan River Valley. But if you go in any detail into what that implied, it implied Israel would essentially continue to control entry and exit, airspace, and so forth. And that was the ultimate thing for Begin. If you go back and read his handwritten notes, Israel has to control security. And what that really means is Israel would be the real sovereign. There would be a Palestinian state within that security envelope controlled by Israel. But that would be the context in which it would take place. So I would argue that in that fundamental respect, the Begin limit was preserved, at least in the Clinton parameters. The Olmert thing is fuzzier for me, because I think Olmert may have gone further. But First of all, Olmert himself was, as was Ehud Barak at the time of the Clinton parameters. Both of these were Israeli prime ministers on shaky grounds, dealing with an American administration that was about to disappear. And so one of the things that I really hold against President Clinton is that he allowed Dennis Ross to run the damn thing into the ground for 3.5 years, and then he finally decided he had to get involved. Well, if he'd gotten involved in 1993 when he was inaugurated, things might have been very different. Had Prime Minister Rabin not been assassinated in 1995, things might have been very different, but that's not the way it happened.
Dennis Ross has a very long life, as we saw under Obama. I think I've time just for a final question, if there's one out there. If not, I will. Okay, in the back, the gentleman with the blue shirt.
Gentleman in the blue shirt.
Hi there. Thanks for the talk. I enjoyed it. I'm just going to follow up on.
Can you introduce yourself, please?
My name's John. I'm John Roth. I'm not a pro. I'm just going to preface that. Just an interested observer. Just to follow up on His Excellency the Ambassador from Norway's question. If you say that Clinton, on his way out, that deal, he didn't, have his successor latched onto it, does that make it any less of a deal, the theoretical deal that was widely reported that Yasser Arafat walked away from at the time? And you seem to draw a very hard line in the last 30 years from Begin and also the American presidents, but in the context of the almost deal at the end of the Clinton administration, as well as the nascent roadmap and quartet of 10 years ago, as well as the way that Sharon was going before he was incapacitated. I was wondering if you could just speak to that broadly.
What about Sharon? Could you amplify what you meant about Sharon? I got the other part of the question.
Just the way of the new Kadima party and the way that only he, as what quote unquote would be like a father of Israel, hedging towards a more centrist way of dealing with the.
But how does that relate to the Palestinians?
Just a way to move the electorate or to move the people of Israel towards the center more, as only someone who is a father of the country can do so. Yeah. How that plays into the parameters that you speak of from the Begin perspective.
Well, let me talk a little bit about 2000 before I talk about Sharon and what he was trying to do. I think that if there was a chance to achieve anything in this process, it didn't come at Camp David 1978. In fact, Camp David probably put a nail into the coffin that I don't think we would necessarily have been able to remove. But if there was a chance to remove that nail, it might have come in 91, 93, 95. And I say that because it is very clear that the first Bush administration, that's say the administration of George Herbert Walker Bush, was willing to exert extraordinary degree of pressure on Israel over the loan guarantees, and dragged the Shamir government kicking and screaming to the conference table. And in so doing, I think helped undermine that government. I mean, I think one of the many reasons that Labor won the subsequent elections in 1992 was what Bush and Baker had done. Israelis came to see not only that the first Intifada had proved that the occupation as it then stood was untenable, but that there was an alternative. And in spite, and they voted against Shamir for that and other reasons. And I would argue that that was a window in 1991, 92. Now that window was partly closed when President Bush was defeated, because in our negotiations, Baker was taken away in the spring of 1992 to take over President Bush's failing re-election campaign. And from that point on, I've argued, there was no adult supervision. That's not my term again. That's Aaron David Miller talking about what he and his colleagues needed from Secretary Baker, because they were not operating as adults. They really were doing a terrible job. And so for reasons that are conjunctural, I mean, this is just the vagaries of American politics, you didn't have continuity. And when the Clinton administration came in, perhaps none of you, some people in this room are too young to remember, this is one of the messiest transitions in American history. It took them ages to get anybody confirmed. It took them ages to decide who was going to take a job because there'd been 12 years of Republicans in office. And, getting people who in the French term are ministrables, who can serve in these positions, was a lot harder than it had been in the three previous terms of the three previous presidents. By the time they got their act together, we were way, way past where things had been at the time of Madrid. And even then, I think you could have conceivably, as late as 93 or 94, done something that might have led to a two-state solution. And why do I say that? Because there was a willingness to imagine possibilities among Palestinians and Israelis in the early to mid-90s, which very rapidly closed off. It closed off for Palestinians because of the actual nature of the Oslo Accords. The Oslo Accords did not create a basis for Palestinian statehood. The Oslo Accords, as far as the Palestinians are concerned, had several consequences. Enormously restrictive conditions of movement. Palestinians, when I was living in Jerusalem in the early 90s, could go anywhere. There was a small subcategory of people with security records who could not move. But there was nobody checking where you moved. If you lived in Balata, in Nablus, you could go to Haifa. If you lived in Khan Yunis, you could drive to the Golan Heights in a Gaza Strip car. Anybody could go anywhere in 1990 or 91. Well, with the Intifada going on, it was a little difficult, but still. There were no physical restrictions. There were no bypass roads. There were no checkpoints. There was no Qalandia. There was no, I could list these hideous checkpoints that are now determine everybody's movement in the occupied territories. It was the Oslo regime that began the separation wall. It wasn't the suicide bombings. It was the Oslo regime. The bypass roads were a fruit of the Oslo Accords. The cutting off of Palestinian labor in Israeli cities, a fruit of the Oslo Accords. The separation of East Jerusalem from the rest of the West Bank, the Oslo Accords. So that by 2000, when Clinton and Arafat and Barak met at Camp David, this process had been adjudged by Palestinian public opinion to be a failure. On the Israeli side, what happened in 94 and 95 with the suicide bombings, the beginnings of the suicide bombings in Israel, had swerved public opinion to the right. And so Netanyahu won in 1996. Netanyahu voted against the Oslo Accords in the Knesset. This is a man who believed that these went far, far, far too far. He believed and he believes. I mean, he gives lip service to them. But this is a man who is faithful, in my view, to the politics of his father, who was the secretary of Jabotinsky, who was the founder of the revisionist movement. So Begin, I mean, when we talk about this line of thought, it's not just that Netanyahu is, a guy who stands by himself. He stands on the shoulders of his father. He was a man who was tutored by Moshe Arens. There's a lovely document that I'm quoting in something I'm writing now, where Arens is arguing with the U.S. Secretary of State in 1982 after the Sabra and Shatila massacres. And who pipes up in the debate? None other than Benjamin Netanyahu, who was in the embassy in Washington at the time. That was his mentor. So he's a Likud prince from the revisionist line, and he doesn't believe in this. He believes that there is a greater land of Israel, and he believes that only the Jewish people have rights in that land. And so he can be forced, as he was forced, to accept aspects of President Clinton dragged him kicking and screaming to Y plantation. But again, I think there you have another moment when an American president exerted pressure on an Israeli prime minister, and the end result was the Israeli public said, well, we really don't want a prime minister who gets us into this kind of trouble with the United States. And that's one of many reasons that Netanyahu's first, lost in that election. But I think that the larger point I'm trying to make is that all three politicians at Camp David in 2000 were well beyond their sell-by date. President Clinton was finished. Arafat had lost the credit that he had gained on his return to Palestine, and Barak had already lost his majority in the Knesset. I mean, he was sort of driving on fumes by that stage. And what he did at Camp David more or less guaranteed that Sharon would be elected, because he came away from Camp David saying, we have no partner for peace. Well, if we have no partner for peace, let's elect the general who knows how to deal with these people. And that's what the Israelis, not stupid people, that's what the Israelis did. If the other guy says, I'm a jerk, and there's nobody for me to talk to, well, who's the better general? I think I'll take Sharon rather than Barak. And Barak was trounced in the subsequent election. So I think that if you look at those larger political dynamics, you can see why this deal doesn't really have the saliency that some people try and give it. I mean, I wish that the parties had accepted something like it, the Clinton parameters. But none of the three actors who were engaged had any political credibility by that stage, unfortunately. A similar deal in 1993 or 1991, in my view, would have been a basis for a Palestinian state, because you had enormous credibility in the Israeli government of Rabin, in Arafat, and in either a newly elected President Clinton or a re-elected President Bush.
Before I wrap this up, I want to remind you again, books for sale on the back. I'm going to keep Rashid right here. When you buy the book, come forward. He will sign here and talk with you. One last thing about the book, it's a short book. As opposed to other books we have here, it's about 125 pages. Our purpose with these evenings is to stimulate, to provoke, and I think we certainly have done this tonight, thanks to Rashid Khalidi.
Thank you.